Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a fabulous story tonight which you're really going to love. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, greeted by a waft of fetid ice-cold air, Prudence, known to her friends as Prudy, opens the latch to the loft, hoisting up her wraparound silky dress to above her knees. She ineptly winches herself up the ladder rather gingerly, with an ungainly, rather immodest, blundering gracelessness, as Prudence regretfully had never been acrobatic or sprightly, to say the very least. She was a woman who had not been blessed with nimble feet. Even as a kid at junior school, her feeble attempts to do handstands on the lawn during gymnastics had been wretchedly pitiful and pathetic, so much so that her gym teacher, Mrs. Contrella, had looked on her woefully, as if she was a tragic lumbering lump of lard or an uncouth sack of potatoes that was pretty close to useless when it came to sports. It was true, of course. Prudence would be the very first to admit she was pretty lousy at sports, but then again, who is good at everything? Mrs. Contrella had never liked Prudence, describing her on her report card as lacking coordination and the dexterity of other children her own age, hinting that it might not be a bad idea for her parents to consider putting Prudence on a strict diet. "Prudence lacks dexterity," she wrote. "She's clumsy and oafish in her attempts to play sports of any kind. I believe her weight is hindering her performance. It might be worthwhile to consider putting your daughter on a regimental calorie-restricted diet. I believe if she lost a few pounds, she might be much more pliable during gymnastics, and wouldn't get out of breath so easily on the sports field when playing ball games with her peers. I've noticed that she has a penchant for all things sweet. It might be advisable to consider removing sugar from her diet. In my experience, that can make a very big difference." "Bloody cheek!" Prudence's mother had said, sounding outraged. She wilfully tore up Prudence's report card in disgust, her eyes growing wide with an offended indignation. "That Mrs. Contrella's got a bloody nerve! Who does she think she is? The Queen of England? How dare she infer that my Prudence is overeating, and that I'm stuffing my little girl with hamburgers, donuts, and hot dogs? Nothing could be further from the truth. That woman needs a dose of reality. Our Prudence has a poor metabolism. That's why she's a little on the chubby side. But it's just puppy fat. You mark my words, when she's older it'll drop off her like water off a dog's coat. My other two children don't have issues with their weight. If I was feeding them far too much, they would be overweight. Is it my fault that Prudence only has to look at a pudding to become one? This Mrs. Contrella is implying that I'm a bad mother, and I won't have anyone undermine my character like this. I'll give that condescending, patronizing, vainglorious woman a piece of my own mind when I see her. How dare she talk about my daughter in such an infuriating, reproachful way? I won't stand for it. I bet she's never had children of her own before. That would explain a whole lot. She doesn't appreciate that every child is uniquely different. They don't come out of the same cereal packet like those miniature toys you get from Kellogg's. Sweetheart, don't overreact, Prudence's father had told his wife, who looked as if she was about to go charging off to the school like a rampaging bull elephant, to give Mrs. Contrella a big slap across the face and offer her an equal measure of humiliation. Even as a little girl, Prudence, who was the oldest of three sisters, had never been outdoorsy or adventurous. Her younger siblings had teased her relentlessly for her inability to climb trees, or to do the rambunctious, wild, carefree things that they enjoyed. Prudy is so fat, which is why she is a brat," they would wilfully tease and torment her unkindly, bringing little Prudence to tears, for she so wanted to be normal like the other kids at school, but she always felt like the odd one out, the one that never fitted in with the other children. It wasn't only because she was a little tubby that she felt like a misfit, but she was more of a thinker than a doer, and found challenging things like climbing trees rather daunting. She was terribly afraid that she'd take a nasty tumble and lose her balance, ending up on the ground crying out in agonizing pain due to a twisted ankle or something even worse. Ostensibly falling and badly injuring yourself was something inconsequential to her two younger siblings, who recklessly never stopped to consider for a moment their own safety, as they climbed the trees in the yard like carefree, nimble acrobats, with the resilience of an elastic band, like so many other kids of their ages. They wore that badge of invincibility proudly on their lapels. They staunchly believed that nothing bad would ever happen to them, and usually it didn't. From the ages of about 8 to 12 years old, Prudence remained frustratingly overweight, even though she'd never once overindulged. Well, that's not entirely true. She couldn't resist all things sweet, and on a recent trip for lunch at the country club with her family, her mother had been overly concerned that Prudence was toying with her food on her plate, as she fiddled around with beans and mashed potatoes, almost as if she had no appetite. Mrs. McIntyre had been worried that Prudence was coming down with a viral infection or something, but she need not have worried about that. It would seem her plump little daughter and her demeanour changed quite dramatically the moment the family embraced the vast selection of mouth-watering delectable puddings on display at the dessert buffet, where Prudence had gone up over 8 consecutive times, returning with a plate overloaded with trifles, creme brulee, creme caramel, chocolate mousse, and all the syrupy concoctions you can think of that make life significantly brighter. And Mrs. McIntyre had noticed a couple of sanctimonious parents giving her judgmental glances, as if to say, "No wonder your daughter is such a porker, if you let her go back to the sweet buffet over 8 times. It would seem that poor Prudence was mercilessly teased about being chubby. Prudence's own father had affectionately called her Fatty when she was a little girl, and those words, meant to be loving, had cruelly cut her to the quick, as no little girl with aspirations of being a princess wants to be called Fatty by their own father, endearing or not. When Prudence was a teenager, her puppy fat had miraculously abandoned her, like a long, odiously laborious battle with athlete's foot that is finally nipped in the bud and goes away, without any apparent rhyme or reason, or any explicable explanation. Even though Prudy became a slender adult, she always falsely believed she was fat, when the reverse was actually true. She wore a dress size 0 without even trying to watch her weight. Her mother told her that this was because the inbuilt fat girl mentality from her childhood had burnt its way into her subconscious mind and was firmly entrenched inside her thin body, so she falsely still perceived herself as that overweight little girl she once had been, as if the fat girl had never truly gone away. Prudence expected this was true, as she remained continuously self-conscious about the way she looked. One thing that had stayed ceaselessly the same, even with the passing of time, was that Prudence continued to be steadfastly ungainly on her feet, which was something she hated about herself. But then again, everybody has things about themselves they may not care about very much, and this was one of Prudence's pet peeves. She'd have loved to possess the grace of a ballet dancer, but clumsiness appeared to be her middle name, that stuck to her rigidly like chewing gum under a classroom desk. These days her once skinny and adroit younger sisters tirelessly struggled with their weight and yo-yoed from one diet plan to the next, while Prudence stayed annoyingly skinny, so the coin had flipped to the other side. So there was some divine justice after all. Her sisters still remained nimble, while Prudence did not. She carried this lack of agility into her adulthood, with her like an extra piece of unfortunate baggage that she could never shift. "Never mind, Prudy," her mother would say. "At least you look like a ballet dancer, even though you move like a herd of rhinos." Prudence knew there was supposed to be a compliment in there somewhere, but she'd be damned if she could find it. She was carelessly always breaking things, barging into furniture, as if she weighed half a ton, and no one could understand why someone so slight could cause so much damage. How she wished she was not so damn ungainly and bumbling on her feet, but it was too bad. It couldn't be helped. She wondered if she should take up yoga. Perhaps that would improve her flow of movement, her posture, ameliorate her coordination. Her mother certainly believed it would be a good idea, and maybe she was right. Her mother tended to be right about a lot of things. To all intensive purposes, if her husband Kyle were to see her right now, ineptly lunging into the depths of this dingy, oppressive attic, congealed with dust, decay, and overhanging cobwebs, he would not be remotely pleased with her. He knew all too well how notoriously floundering on her maladroit feet she could be, and would be grievously concerned that she would wobble precariously on the step-ladder and take a nasty tumble by unreliably losing her footing. It wouldn't be the first time Prudence had fallen. Over the years, her obvious lack of balance had caused her to break wrists and ankles that she had acquired from her numerous falls. She was very accident-prone. The couple, spirited, overzealous schnauzers, Pipkin and Wallace, seemed to find their mother's adventurous soiree this morning up a spindly, rickety staircase into the heart of the attic, where she promptly just disappeared into the tenebrific folds of the house, to be like some enchanting magic act. The two rambunctious bundles of mischief no doubtedly thought that this was some kind of brand new game, so they hovered excitedly on the wooden floor beneath the ladder, padding impatiently at the lower rung, with their eager paws, almost as if waiting for a white rabbit to materialize out of the ether for them to delightedly give chase. "Calm down, will you?" said Prudence, looking down nervously from the step-ladder at her two animated dogs, who kept pawing the lower rung and barking at her excitedly, looking up at her with inquisitive dark eyes. "I'll be down in a second, Wallace, but don't go messing with that ladder. I don't want to fall. I just need to check something out." She pointed an accusing finger at both dogs. "Don't mess with that ladder, Pipkin. I need to get down, do you understand?" Pipkin, on hearing his name, obediently sat down on his haunches, barking up the ladder excitedly, wondering when the fun and games was going to start, as Prudence was certainly taking her time about it. Prudence's husband Kyle worked from an office in the house. He commuted to New York 2 days of the week. The couple were both in their early 30s, but Prudence was still young and fresh-faced. She didn't look a day over 22. The couple had recently moved to Kyle's grandfather's 18th century farmhouse that bordered the Finger Lake National Park in New York State, that spans over 16,000 acres, located on the ridged backbone between the Seneca and Cayuga Lakes, which was a 5-hour trip from downtown New York. Kyle's grandfather was living in a very becoming old-age home. He had insisted on leaving his old farmhouse to his favourite grandson, who reminded him of himself, so it was a given that the farmhouse would one day be handed over to Kyle, but no one had expected it to happen while the old man was still alive. Kyle's grandfather had taken great delight in signing over the deeds of his beloved property to his grandson. "There you go, son. Oakwood Rise is all yours." "But I don't know what to say, Gramps," said Kyle. "There are no words. You know what this place means to me. I have so many fabulous childhood memories here, and I can't believe it's now mine." "You don't have to thank me, son. It's an absolute privilege to pass on my home to you, and to Prudence, of course. I hope you make many happy memories in this special place, and have lots of children here." Prudence had grown up in New York, in the green leafy neighborhood of Forest Hills in Queens, with her parents and her two younger siblings, Paisley and Jolene, in a modern home designed by an up-and-coming avant-garde trendy architect. Even though there were other modern houses in the neighborhood, not many were as pioneeringly unconventional and cutting-edge in design as the McIntyre residence. Many houses in Forest Hill went right back down the long ribbon of time, all the way to the 1920s. The neighborhood boasted a rich, vibrant history, which could be fully appreciated in the architecture. Prudence liked the Italianate houses in Sunnyside, Jackson Heights, and St. Albans, made from Worcestershire stone, which apparently is more durable than brownstone. But her mother's influences over her life made her distance herself from all historic buildings. Prudence's parents, Mr. and Mrs. McIntyre, had had a proverbial bee in their bonnet about old houses, regarding them with a scathing scepticism and scant disregard, as if it was something you should avoid at all costs, like a fast-growing mould in your property or a rampant contagious disease that could potentially kill you. which was ridiculous, as some of the historic architecture in Queens was quite stunning. But Mrs. McIntyre did not see it that way. "Everything goes wrong in an old house," Prudence' mother would tirelessly repeat, like an old record. "I will never, and I repeat, never ever live in an old house myself. One person may have breathed their last there. Imagine that," she said, shuddering in abject disgust, as if the very thought completely revulsed her. "I just couldn't do it myself. There could be some kind of residual energy there. People might think I'm being overbearingly dramatic, but I assure you I'm not. I have personally felt presences in old houses before, along with the feeling of always being watched by a pair of unseen eyes. My grandfather Corey saw a ghost once, and boy did he have a story to tell. And that story I dare not repeat. These things do exist, you know. We cannot see these things, as the electromagnetic spectrum to the human eye is very limiting. But I've sensed these things before, and I know it's not my imagination. I, for one, would not welcome a ghostly encounter of any kind. For one thing, I'd never get a wink of sleep at night. I'd always be wondering if something I couldn't see from beyond the veil was clandestinely watching me. A former resident of the house, perhaps, getting angry with me for taking down a wall. In a new house, you know what you're getting. There are no nasty surprises loitering in the dark shadows, ready to pounce on you unawares. Worst of all, there is so much maintenance in an old house. Everything goes badly awry. Leaks in the roof, cracks in the windows, damp or mould festering along the corners of the house, or an aggressive infestation of termites in the wood, eating your house up with an insatiable hungry appetite that is almost impossible to thwart. Unless, of course, you dig deep into your pockets to pay for an expert to exterminate the wretched things at a vast amount of money. No, thank you very much. That's not for me. I could do without all that. I mean, look at poor Mrs. Rodriguez at number 32. The woman has had to spend thousands of dollars of her hard-earned cash fixing the plumbing in her ancient, decrepit house. Do you know how many times I've seen the plumber's van parked outside her property? And that man's bills are not cheap. God knows what she sees in that claustrophobic, damp, airless place that smells of fish mothballs and prehistoric furniture polish, that I dare say dates back to the days of Noah and the Ark. You don't have any of those problems in a new home, do you?" Prudence had grown up in a house that enjoyed the modernistic benefits of contemporary artwork, minimalistic, unyielding furniture, where glass, chrome, linen and leather were introduced into the decor. The walls of the McIntyres' residence were made of both glass and steel that overlooked the neighbourhood. The only trouble with living in a geometrically square-shaped glass house like this was that it was immodestly transparent, rather like a see-through dress that flauntingly, unabashedly leaves very little to the imagination. So it came with significant drawbacks. For one thing, Prudence would often feel conspicuous, rather like a bug in a glass jar, as if she was completely naked, and everybody was watching her. It would seem people could practically look through the glass front doors into the bowels of the McIntyre residence, so privacy was a luxury not afforded to the McIntyre family. For some reason her mother never seemed to be upset about her life being on visual display to the outside world, like another bombastic television edition of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Even door-to-door salesmen would always know you were in, and so Prudence's parents couldn't feign being out, for the salesman would invariably spot you in the front room, and wave madly at you with a bright, presumptuous smile on his face, as if to say, "I've got you. Now you're going to listen to my highly exaggerated, over-the-top, impassioned spiel about why I sell the best plant fertilizers door to door on this side of Queens." Prudence remembered local pedestrians and snoopy neighbours alike, walking their dogs audaciously down the street. They seemed incapable in sashaying past their house in a straight line, without taking that obvious turn in the road, so they would inquisitively look straight into the McIntyres' family residence to see what they were doing on Sunday afternoon. It would seem their inquisitiveness had no boundaries. Old Mr. Curtis Barry, from number 30, was the worst offender of all in this regard. He would deliberately let his dog Juniper off the lead, accidentally on purpose, so that the dog would bullet to the McIntyres' front door, where the McIntyres' family dog, a Scottish terrier called Trixie, who barked excitedly whenever Juniper made an appearance. The dog would stare at her and rub his wet nose against the glass pane. The two dogs would become incredibly excitable, like fireworks that had been lit, and then much backwards and forwards loud yapping would ensue. The next thing you know is you would hear Mr. Barry scolding his dog Juniper. "Get back here, boy. Don't be so naughty," he would say, approaching the sheer glass door and peering right in at the McIntyres family to have a good old nosy gawk. One time he pressed his nose against the window and looked right in at them, giving the McIntyre family a gormless grin, shrugging his shoulders apologetically to express his extreme indignation for his dog's insubordinate behaviour, as if he was powerless to stop a lightweight 25-pound dog from escaping his lead. When Mr. Barry himself was no slip of a man, and he had been a black belt in judo once, Mr. Barry, resuming his hold on the lead, would walk away from the McIntyre glass residence with a hesitant reluctance, as if he'd like to stay there all day, staring in at them, watching their comings and goings, like goldfish swimming around a glass bowl. But Mrs. McIntyre had laughed it all off, waving a hand across her face nonchalantly, and said, "Oh, poor Mr. Barry. He is rather snoopy, but he just has a boring life. At least looking in at our family has brightened his day somewhat." Prudence and her sisters did not see it in the same way, and were aggrieved about the feeling of being watched all the time by the locals in the neighbourhood, as if they were permanently on display, like the crown jewels in the Tower of London. Prudence had despised the rude invasion of privacy in living in a house made of glass. There really was something to be said for having less windows in a house, to enjoy the full benefits that privacy invited for you. But her mother believed in a light, airy home, with rooms that seamlessly conjoined together to create a large, wide, sprawling space, with no invasive walls blocking the harmonious flow. She felt their house invited the outside in, and did so very successfully. For more times than Prudence cared to remember, she had consigned to oblivion that there were glass partitions everywhere, blocking her path into the yard, and had on occasion clumsily walked into the glass panes, more than a handful of times, bumping her nose on the glass pane and being flung haphazardly backwards on her feet. "Honestly, Prudence," her mother would laugh, "you are dreadfully clumsy, my girl. You know the glass is there, so why are you walking into it?" It was during thunderstorms and disturbingly hot weather, when glaringly obtrusive sunshine would charge through the house like an unwelcome guest, that Prudence found most unappealing, even more so than old Mr. Barry and his snoopiness. It was on these less than favourable occurrences that Prudence had hated living in her parents' modern home, for sometimes there were times the lightning had felt far too close for comfort, as if she might catch a light like a firework herself, and go up into the sky in a pillow of light. It would seem her mother's staunchingly prejudicial aversions of old houses had rubbed off on Prudence exponentially. It was hard not to be persuaded by the partisan biases of her parents. Prudence had emphatically decided from a young age that she too would give old houses a wide berth when she was older, and would never be foolish enough to live or even purchase a place that was cocooned in the silken fabric of a colourful history, for she was certain that the imprints of all the former residents that had lived in such historic houses over the centuries would have left their indelible impressions on a place, so their formidable stains, whether they be good or bad, could not be easily washed away. And who, she would privately think, would want to live in a place as ill-omened as that? Much like her mother, Prudence had believed in the existence of ghosts, and she had very good reasons for feeling this way, beyond her great-grandfather Corey's rather personal ghostly account. On one occasion as a young girl at school, after being bullied relentlessly for being chubby, she had run off in tears away from the horrible bullies, mocking her on the school playground, attacking her like a little fawn being ripped apart by dozens of coyotes. "You're big, fat and ugly. You're stupid," Tiffany Morris had told her tauntingly. "You can't even do a handstand 'cause you're so fat," she said, sticking out her tongue rudely at Prudence. "Your legs, they're as big as tree trunks. Your legs are huge." The other girls began to sing out the tune that she knew only too well. Prudence is big and fat, that is why she is such a prat. Prudence is big and fat, that is why she's such a prat. With tears of dejection blooming in her eyes like sorrowful raindrops, amidst the nasty jeering, Prudence had run away to the bottom of the school playground to seek refuge from the kids' deriding words of ridicule. She loved the sequestered part of the school playground. The quintessential sanctuary cushioned her from the blows of the word bombs that had been spat at her so cruelly. In this secret place there was an old family graveyard, of time-worn 18th century gravestones. Some were crooked and rather jagged, like unsightly disintegrating teeth sticking protuberantly out of a pair of diseased gums. The tumble-down graves were covered in a plethora of moss and lichen. Sadly, the names of the deceased had long been forgotten and eroded away by the cadence of time. Prudence would stare at these gravestones in unparalleled wondrous awe. This is what happens to us when we die, she thought. One day we'll all be forgotten, our names remembered no more. And for her such haunting thoughts were pretty sobering. It brought everything into perspective, she thought. Still, she was very young, with her entire life ahead of her, unless, of course, fate intervened in a haplessly unfortunate way, and she was run over by a bus in the morning. But failing that, she still may have a good 80 years left of life, if she was lucky. Life was still worth living, even if the mean kids at school called her horrible, disparaging names. Prudence had always run to the small little collection of family graves, on the furthest end of the school grounds, whenever she felt melancholic, as for some reason they seemed to offer her comfort and solace. The stones did not talk back to her so cruelly, like the mean kids did, who had nothing better to do than needlessly spit out venom at her, for reasons she had never fully comprehended. But she knew they enjoyed tearing her apart, like a vulture with a carcass. Prudence would brush her hands over the stones, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers, wondering about the life that had long since been extinguished, and saddened that the name of the dead person was no longer visible on the stone. It was rumoured that the entire family had owned this distinguished residential property in 1843, that had been cruelly wiped out by an attack of German measles. Whether the rumours were true, Prudence had never been sure. The vast sprawling residential federal-style building on the verdant grounds, where this prominent, well-to-do family had once lived, had been converted into an old girls' private school in the 1950s, and the affluent history was something that was proudly flaunted. Whatever Prudence's mother may say about modern buildings, there was no doubt that many of the modern schools in the borough, with their simplistic designs, failed to compare with the school that Prudence attended, and her mother said as much. Well, it's an old superb building, very distinguished. There is no doubt about that. But I'll bet you this, Prudence, this place still has got its ghosts. Prudence wasn't sure how old she was when she saw the ghost in pure daylight. The sky was as blue as a cornflower, the day warm and bright, poisoned by the toxic residue of the mean bullying words of her classmates that were still ringing loudly in her ears. You're ugly, you're fat, and you're stupid. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the lofty trees on that morning. Its bracing tingles were like gentle caressing fingers, touching Prudence tenderly with a brisk kindness. No one ever came to this part of the school grounds that was so often neglected and abandoned, but that made it all the more special to Prudence. She liked it here. She felt safely alone with her thoughts, and the gravestones had become like old reassuring friends. On this occasion she was staring at the stones, and became acutely aware that she was no longer alone. She was being watched. She looked up cautiously to see a very beautiful woman. The lovely woman was wearing an extravagantly stylish dress that was almost as blue as the sky itself. She looked like the photographs Prudence had seen of Scarlett O'Hara, with skin as fair as a lily, hair as dark as a raven's feathers. But it was the spirited, humourful green eyes of this woman that got Prudence's attention. The woman had smiled brightly at Prudence, meeting her gaze, and then she turned around and vanished before Prudence's very eyes. And in that astonishing, surreal moment, Prudence realized she'd seen a ghost. Did one of the old gravestones belong to this woman, she wondered? It would seem so. Prudence was sure she'd seen the former resident of the property, before it was converted into a school. It made sense to her that sometimes the spirits of the departed, who might not even know they're dead, would hang around places and graveyards like this. She was sure the woman she'd seen at the school grounds, near the old graves, did know she was dead, but had reached out to her in a day when she felt so dejected, to give her a warm, encouraging smile, almost as if to say, things will get better. Even though the woman, clad in spectacular 1800s attire, had never spoken a word to Prudence, sometimes communication can be silent. She'd never forget the reassuring kindness of the woman, her lively green eyes, and had always felt that she had been meant to see this ghost. It had certainly made her challenging, rather tumultuous time at school become a lot more bearable. It would seem that after that paradoxical encounter with the strange ghostly apparition, that the bully's words at school no longer carried much weight for her. She would shut them out, swatting them away like an annoying fly buzzing around a sweet can of cola. Ostensibly, when she ceased to react to the bully's unkind words, the bullying miraculously stopped, as the kids were not getting any rise out of the much bolder, more confident Prudence. Prudence was disappointed not to see the ghostly apparition of the lovely woman again, for she felt some kind of connection with the lovely lady. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story tonight, which is fantastic. So I look forward to you joining me next on tomorrow's session. Until next time, goodbye and good night.